Good evening, and thank you once again for joining us for the second of our brand new webinar series, Resiliency Skills. With the critical time that we are facing, we are planning and delivering weekly webinars on introductory gardening and kitchen skills. People can send suggestions for topics they'd like for us to cover to our NOFA Mass Education Director, Carol Roselle at Carol, C-A-R-O, at nofamass.org. Next week, our next webinar will be Foraging for Tasty Wild Edibles in Your Backyard and Neighborhood with Russ Cohen, and we'll give you another reminder at the end of this webinar. My name is Anna Gilbert Muhammad, and I'm the Food Access and Webinar Coordinator for NOFA Mass. My email is anna@nofamass.org. Feel free to contact me with questions about any of our webinar presentations, whether it's our Resiliency Skills series or our Inspiring Ideas from Expert in the Field series. Before we start this evening, I would like to take this time to thank our sponsor for this particular episode of our Resiliency webinars, Black Earth Compost. Black Earth Compost provides both food waste collection and composting across Eastern Mass. I'd also like to thank all of the NOFA Mass board and staff in the production of this webinar and all of our future webinars. Most importantly, we want to thank you, our viewers and listeners, for joining us today. If you find that these webinars are useful to you, please consider joining NOFA Mass as a member or making a donation to support our staff to do this work. Any amount helps. Visit our website at nofamass.org to learn more information. This evening, our webinar is all about starting a garden safely, and we are joined by our panelists tonight, Allison Houghton, Soil Technical Assistance Co-Coordinator, Backyard Gardens, Urban Farmers, Small-Scale Growers from Lexington, Massachusetts, Laura Davis, NOFA Board Chair, Soil Technical Assistance Co-Coordinator, and Organic Certification. She's from Hopkins, Massachusetts. Myself, Anna Gilbert Muhammad, I'm also part of the Soil Technical Assistance team. I work with Backyard Gardens and Community Gardens, and I'm based in Springfield, Massachusetts. And sharing the controls with me tonight is Carol Roselle. She is NOFA's Education Director. She coordinates the Soil Carbon Proxy Testing Program, and she'll be our moderator tonight for our question and answer portion, and she's out of Wendell, Massachusetts. Now, tonight's format is going to be a little different. We will have a panel. First, Allison will give a presentation, and we'll have a panel discussion that will include all of your questions and answers. So for those of you who are listening by phone, you can feel free to email your questions directly to Carol Roselle at Carol, C-A-R-O, at nofamass.org, or you can text them to 413-214-1237. Those of you who are watching, actually logged in to this webinar, feel free to either use the chat feature or the question feature on your dashboard to send in any questions. And those questions will be given to our panel at the end during that Q&A session. So please sit back, relax. I'll give the controls over to Allison so she can begin her presentation. Look forward to talking with you all at the end.
Where you get a lot more sunlight, maybe the trees haven't filled out yet, then you can kind of maximize the potential for that time of the season. This just next picture, this is my back area just taken today, actually. And one thing that's you can see, again, you can see those arcs. These are 3 different pictures put together. And you can see at the very top, March is, the sun is much, much higher in the sky. If I were standing out in the garden right at this moment, I could, almost directly overhead would be where the sun is coming from at the peak of the summer solstice. So you can kind of get a sense for where it's going. And this is really, really useful. You'll actually notice that, so where I'm standing in this picture it's one of the side gardens. And you'll actually notice that I do actually get a fair amount of sunlight in December, especially for the fact that these trees back here, they don't have any leaves on, so I can maximize my winter growing and really looking out in your yard, this is a perfect time of year to go outside and see where the sun is coming from, see where the buildings are. Sometimes moving a garden just a foot over, if you have the capacity to do it, whether it's a raised bed, containers, or in the ground, can really make a huge difference. And I've seen some places, you know, just a few feet over, you get 8 hours of sun, and a few feet back, just the way that the buildings are lined up, you actually go down to 3 or 4, which is a lot difficult, or a lot different for growing. Another thing to consider is easy access, not only to the garden itself for seeding and harvesting, but also for water. So you want to make sure you choose a place that has access to water, whether that's a spigot or if you're in an urban area. Many places it's a lot tricky, or it's very tricky to get access to city water unless you're near a building. So just be really mindful of that. If you're starting a new garden, you ideally do want to have a ready, easy to access water point. Some people will use, mostly hand watering. You can use rain barrels to, if you have limited access, to kind of buffer the downtimes. Also, drip irrigation is also a possibility. You can put it on a timer if you don't think you'll remember. So there's a lot of different options, a lot of them very inexpensive. Also, another thing to keep in mind is the ability to retain water and moisture in the soil by doing strategies such as mulching or other things. Also, when you're building a garden, whether it's a raised bed in ground or containers, just be really, really mindful of putting too much pressure on your garden, either by stepping in it or kind of walking all around it. You really want to make sure that you do not compact the soil and lose all that air and structure and make it harder for the soil biology to thrive. So that's just something to think about, designating pathways, stepping stones, just something to making the garden bed shorter so that you can reach the middle. Think about that the peak season highest tomato plant you can think of, if it's in the middle of a 8-foot by 8-foot bed, it's a lot harder to get to. So just be mindful of those aspects when siting a garden. One of the big things in a city, and also sometimes or suburban places as well, is contamination. So I've done a lot of testing of soil in and around the greater Boston area, and sadly, it comes back again and again that there are contaminants in soil, especially in urban areas, but also alongside old buildings or other things. There are several contaminants that are particularly problematic, but lead oftentimes is, I think it's the most common that I've seen. In testing for other things, I've seen sometimes some other issues, but oftentimes lead is also there as well. So that is oftentimes, so when I talk about contamination, I'm oftentimes referring to lead, although you can occasionally have other weird things as well. So where does lead come from, or other contamination? A number of different things, but lead specifically is particularly pervasive in the environment because it used to be in paint. So if you are siting a garden next to an old building, just be extremely mindful of, there's usually in a halo around the building between 2 or 3 feet. Oftentimes there can be higher lead levels right around there. Leaded gasoline used to be a thing. Doesn't usually affect urban gardens unless you were by a roadway that had a lot of traffic and the garden is sited directly next to it and it's an in-ground garden. So usually I haven't seen elevated lead levels from that alone, unless something little bizarre happened, or maybe somebody dumped gasoline or something like that. So there's a lot of reasons why lead can accumulate, and some of them are predictable, some of them are not. Burned trash piles, again, that's hard to pinpoint when you're testing. So again, as you're working with your soil, look for indicators that something might not be quite right, like charred trash or other things. One other thing that a lot of people don't realize is old orchards also tend to have high lead levels. Lead arsenate used to be a pesticide at the beginning of the century, and that's it's 1900s. And so oftentimes you do get weird elevated levels in those areas as well. One thing I would say that the best thing you can do is get your soil tested. Right now, unfortunately, the soil testing lab at UMass is not open. They have closed for the COVID-19 for safety reasons. But as far as I know right now, University of Connecticut and University of Maine are open for testing. And they do also test for lead. So they'll give a basic nutrient analysis, and then they will also test for lead. If you cannot do that, or if you are, you can also check directly for if you see old lead paint, or you think it's lead paint, you can buy a fairly inexpensive lead check test. So these are the pictured on the side. The swabs, you can actually, they're pretty inexpensive, and then you can actually check individual paint chips and just see if you have lead there too. So that can also just like save you a little bit. If you don't have lead or you're not seeing it, that's really just another positive thing. Or if you do have lead, existing lead paint, don't put a raised bed garden directly underneath it. So just be mindful of those things. I would say I'm going to give some options for dealing with lead, but the overall thing is just be really, really careful with lead and other contaminants. So ideally, you want to make this, you want to have a lot of confidence growing in your space, and you want to be able to feel good about eating fresh, nutritious food, but also know that it's safe, especially as we support our families, but also communities. If you have an abundant garden, you want to make sure that you're being responsible in how you grow. So oftentimes soil tests will give you low, medium, or high lead levels. Every soil testing lab has a slightly different metric depending on how they do their test. So their numbers might be slightly different, but they're at the low level. Soils typically have a certain amount of lead, and that's normal, very low levels, and that's fine. There's usually a threshold that gets triggered. Every soil testing lab should have kind of a guide to their own scale, but generally low is not typically a problem. You might want to just be extra careful especially if you have kids or you're pregnant, or on any number of different things where you're just slightly more at risk. And also medium lead levels. If you're on the lower end of medium, you might be able to go a little further, but as you get to the higher end of medium and also high lead levels, it can be really serious. So I would follow recommendations from those organizations if you do experience that. So here's my backyard, and so the window here circled in red. This was this has lead paint around the end, and chips have been falling off. So we're still trying to figure out how to remove it safely without causing more chips to fall down. And so in the meantime, you can kind of see a lot of mulch, organic matter happening. This red arrow in the very, very back, there's a fence there. There used to be a fence there that had lead paint on it. We removed it as carefully as we could. We put tarps down, and then after we removed it, we put in these raised beds, and there's one visible here, but you'll see others later on. But that it's really incredible how much just a little bit, like you can actually see the chips flaking off, and you can see all the different pieces. So be mindful again that 2 to 3 feet space in particular, you'll get a higher lead concentration. So when I did a soil test in this back garden, before I knew that this was lead, so I had a suspicion, but what I did is I tested this area specifically, this back area, and then I tested in the other side of the garden. It's kind of a U shape. And I got low lead levels for both. This one was slightly elevated, but I did also test the paint chips, and they came back higher. Oftentimes when you take a lead test, you will oftentimes take a representative sample. And so what I think happened is I just took too many samples, and so I think the front of this garden is actually much lower lead, and the back has higher higher lead levels. I think they're not super high based on, because I think this was repainted at one point, but just something to be mindful of. So just be really aware of when you're testing, again, that 2 to 3 foot window right around buildings, you can get particularly elevated levels. So knowing that, if you even have a concern about there potentially being lead, then maybe, you know, don't plant something there, or plant something that's not susceptible to uptaking lead. You know, maybe pollinator plants or any number of things there. So just keep that in mind as you're going forward. This is the front of our house, and what we found. So this is, there are we live up on the 3rd floor, and there are a couple windows and things that have old paint. So I don't know if we haven't been able to test the outside, but what we found is this area tested very high for lead. And my understanding is that I think the way the wind blows, all the paint chips and the gutters and other things, they wash down, and actually every time it rains, we get paint chips in here. So that is you have to be very mindful of that, but there's also ways to deal with it. So it doesn't happen very often anymore, but what we do is anytime I see some, I'll remove them, throw them away, but also making sure that they're mulched, having a living plant cover, and really working on remediating or building up the soil itself. So the more organic matter you have, the more living cover. So we're just working on building up that biology in the soil as a buffer for this area, because plants don't want to uptake lead if they don't have to. So this area, you could think from a growing standpoint, isn't that useful. But in the summer, what we can do is put in a ton of pollinator plants, host plants for different species. We can get a lot of growth happening here and really support our beneficial insect population, beneficial predators, all those different things. So there are ways to use bits of property that don't, even if you do have a lead there. One of the strategies for minimizing lead or other contamination is to create or to mulch. So lead uptake, you're much more likely to ingest lead through dust on the produce than through the plant's own uptake itself. So the plant doesn't want to uptake the lead molecules. But if your soil is deficient in certain nutrients, it will pull those up. And so the more deficient and the more kind of stressed your soil is, the more likely you're going to get uptake. So one of the strategies, just purely to minimize dust, if you think about it, and maximize your biology in the soil, is mulching. Every time it rains, you minimize splashback on plants. This is also just a great strategy in general. It holds more moisture in the soil. You don't have to water as much. You're building up soil carbon. You're doing a lot of different things there. So it's a really good strategy anyway, but particularly helpful for when you're dealing with lead or potential lead. So this area right here, this is actually a cherry tree. We knew we were going to put it in the ground. So really amending the soil right around here. And then also there's a living plant cover around it as well. Another thing to do is trellis or keep certain plants, either grow upright crops or trellis them. So things like strawberries might not be a good idea, especially if even if they're mulched, you know, they kind of nuzzle their way down into the mulch and sit on the dirt. So you kind of want to avoid some of those crops and get them off the soil, or really be mindful of washing them. Increasing organic matter content, as I've mentioned, is a great way to increase the biological buffer of the soil. So again, that soil food web is key to kind of immobilizing certain and mobilizing the right nutrients for your plants. That community, the biological community, really works with your plants to provide what they need when they need it. And lead is not one of those, and other contaminants are not those, not what plants need. So the more thriving you have that environment, the better. So you can see there's a living ground cover underneath this cherry tree. There's a lot of different ways you can increase the organic matter content. So organic matter it's like it increases your soil's capacity to hold nutrients. so that as you build up your organic matter, you also build up the soil's capacity to hold onto nutrients for longer in the soil. So it really, think of it kind of like it's your soil's spongy capacity. It holds moisture, it holds air, it holds nutrients, all those different things, and it also is a house for a thriving soil biology as well. So there's a lot of different options for doing that, mulching, but also adding things like a really nice biologically balanced compost, humates, biochar, straw, wood chips on the top, all sorts of different things, adding things that have a great spectrum of micronutrients as well. So just think about that as you're putting your garden together, and you can really emphasize or maximize the potential, even if you think you might have kind of lower or medium lead, you might have some lead in your soil, because even if you are the best tester around, you may miss some spots. So just know where you are, get tests, but also just get a sense for where you might have problems. Also adjust what you can grow. This is a little tiny gooseberry plant that I just put in the ground. It's just budding out. But it's in the corner of the garden that doesn't have, it has an unpainted window, which is great. And it has a lot of rabbit litter and compost and some other things kind of around it, amended with the soil. So this, and on a little trellis, and it's not in an area that I flagged as a high concern. But again, you want to be careful because you just want to be mindful of how the soil was used previously. So one thing to do is, or to know, that fruiting crops tend not to, this is a generalization, but fruiting crops tend not to accumulate lead in the fruit itself. If you have medium to high lead levels, I think the first crop and I'm talking mostly edibles, but leafy greens are the most likely to accumulate stuff in their leaves, or dust on the leaves or in between them. And then also root crops will also, because they're also in the soil, it's easier to eat the dirt, but also they also uptake things a little more quickly than fruiting crops. So just be mindful of that, and you can kind of, if you do not have full confidence in your soil, you can shift things. Maybe all your fruiting crops go in an area that is a little more suspect, and your other crops like lettuce, greens, carrots, radishes, whatever it is, might go in large container gardens or raised beds or anything like that. So keep that in mind as you're planting. Be also aware that some plants can hyperaccumulate lead and other toxins. Sunflowers are one of them, so they actually can hyperaccumulate lead in their seeds. Same with comfrey and a couple other things. They can hyperaccumulate toxins as well as beneficial things. However, I will say that the more biologically active your soil is, and the higher organic matter and all these different kind of that bank account in your soil, the less effective they are at hyperaccumulating lead, from what I've heard. So that's just something to be aware of. One other thing that I think is really interesting and really helpful for people is to be mindful of what your soil pH is. If you have naturally acidic soils, just be aware that in acidic soils, lead is a lot more available. So lead becomes increasingly available, as a couple other nutrients do. So aluminum is another one that becomes increasingly available, as well as you get more acidic. And so try to balance out your soil pH. And keep it in that 6 to 7, ideally maybe even 6.5 to 7, somewhere in that range, which is the ideal range for a vegetable garden. I will say that instead of just working to shift pH, really looking at balancing plant nutrients. So if you're interested in learning more about this, I know Laura also can also help answer some questions as well about how to balance that out. But really what you're looking is your calcium, magnesium, potassium, and sodium. So these ratios in the soil can really adjust the pH. Specifically calcium and magnesium, they have a really interesting relationship in the soil. And one thing that I think is very fascinating and also very encouraging is that calcium is a really, really important nutrient. It's really important for fruit formation. It also mobilizes other nutrients in the plant. And it also is a big positively charged a cation, which is like essentially a positively charged molecule or element, and it mimics lead. So it's really similar to the shape and size of lead, or lead mimics calcium. So if your soils are really calcium deficient, which happens a lot in New England, then you are much more likely to uptake lead. So just ensure you have good levels of calcium in particular, but really when you get a soil test, you'll get a sense for what those ratios are, and you can get recommendations from the soil test. Again, in lieu of that, or in addition to that, just be mindful of some of the sources of calcium. So high calcium lime, not dolomitic lime. Dolomitic lime has high levels of magnesium, and it can mess up your soil if you don't need magnesium. Oyster shells, finely crushed eggshells, gypsum. There's a lot of different things that can increase calcium in the soil or help. Gypsum is an interesting one for kind of helping to make it's a more readily available form of calcium, but it may not build up your levels over time. So just be mindful of that. And again, ensure good levels of micronutrients and trace elements. So adding materials that have a really wide range of micronutrients. So seaweed is a classic option. There's a lot of rock dusts, things like green sand or leather soft rock phosphates. There's a lot of different things that have a wide blend of micronutrients. Again, add these in response to a soil test. You don't want to add something that you really don't need. But again, in a garden setting, and because there's so many different levels of management, you can also feel free to trial things and see if you get a response as well. So again, like especially if you're growing in raised beds or containers where you know your soil is safe, you've brought it in, then you can do that as well. So, and try that out. So I have a couple just advanced options for remediation. This is for people who really want to go an extra step and in dealing with contamination. I will say that if you have an area or a lot or a side garden that you know is really high, this is not really, and these recommendations are mostly for remediating or kind of building it back. They're not for doing alongside growing vegetables in the same space. So just be mindful of how you set up your space. So this is kind of for projects on the side, although a lot of these options, for example, spent substrate from local mushroom production, I'll talk about that in just a second, but that is a slow release fertilizer that can be used anywhere. So these are a couple different options, but so spent substrate, I'll start with that. It's when you're producing mushrooms, oftentimes you use straw or some other material and you inoculate it and it gets all white. And as the mycelium from the mushrooms spreads through it and eats the nutrients in the straw, so that you can produce really good quality oyster mushrooms, shiitake, or find somebody who does. And the leftover stuff, once it's done, the mushrooms are done with it, that leftover material is full of lots of enzymes. And those enzymes can break down organic pollutants. They can rip apart hydrocarbons. They are really incredible at remediating soil or helping if you think you have issues on your site. So for, if you are by a driveway, there's oil that maybe washes in the garden here and there. Mushrooms are amazing at eating oil and other things. So just be mindful of that, and that's a great option. Microremediation is using mushrooms specifically to remediate soils. Some mushrooms do hyperaccumulate toxins. It has a little bit of challenge with it, so you have to you have to harvest those mushrooms and dispose of them. Same with plant accumulators. like sunflowers comfrey, which we talked about a little bit. So you can use these. These are very, at least for plant accumulators, it's a very slow process. So this is not something you can do in a season or two, but this is like on the order of like a decade. If you have medium lead levels, or you want to do something with the land to kind of bring it back as you're kind of maybe working with raised beds elsewhere. So just this is a really, they're great skills. If you're interested in learning more, the Microremediation Handbook by Alex Dorr is an excellent resource. And then also the website Earth Repair by Leela Darwish is incredible. So there's a lot of resources out there. I'm happy to talk more about that in questions. And also there are some biological products that you can buy that will help break down toxins. One from Advancing Eco Agriculture is it's called OP8, and it's a blend of algae, bacteria, a number of biologicals to break down hydrocarbons very specifically. So it's targeted for those and to kind of boost the soil's regenerative capacity. Okay, so I'm going to pause from the contamination piece. There's a lot more we can talk about in questions, but I do want to get to the end so we have time for the panel. Garden options, just going back to this, in-ground gardens are, if you can establish a garden in the ground, that is ideal. You're working with the soil you already have, you're working to build it up. If you have an area that's in the ground that has ideal sun, it has minimal or manageable problems with contamination, then that's great. You can rapidly build up soil in place too. So a couple options for rapidly building soil. One of them is lasagna gardening, and it kind of happens just as it sounds. You build lots of layers of different materials. The example on the right here is just an example that you can add lots of different other types of materials. So oftentimes if you have, say, a lawn or sod, you can mark out where you want, you flip the sod over, and then you just start adding materials. So shredded leaves, newspaper, cardboard, compost, any number of different materials, rock dust, you can add those micronutrients in there as well. One thing I will say is if you're adding anything from your surrounding environment, just be mindful of anything that could get in there. So for example, if you are raking leaves from below your house that has lots of paint chips that might have lead, just be mindful again of introducing a contaminant into your area, specifically by adding runoff or other things into your site. So also sometimes lawn clippings, if they're not treated, that's great. But hugelkultur is another one. It's essentially buried, it means buried wood, but it's similar to lasagna gardening, but in mounds, or you can dig it down. But if you have a lot of wood, it's a way of doing that with wood products. So you can kind of, as the wood breaks down, you have this beautiful fungal rich, water retaining garden. So you can do a lot of things with that. I encourage you to look up more information about any of these options. There's a lot of information online. And another option is a compost and wood chip method. So it's compost, a really nice compost if you can, in bulk. You can get bulk deliveries, and then alternated with wood chips. So once you, and you can just add as many layers as you want. I've seen or heard people do it on asphalt. So they just, if they weren't able to remove the asphalt, they ended up putting multiple layers and building up the soil quite rapidly. The compost has a lot of biology. The wood chips break down and are a great fungal food as long as you don't mix them into the compost layer. So essentially, as you're doing this, you want to let it sit, and you don't want to till it up. Tilling it up will kind of bind up the nitrogen and cause some problems. So you want to just make sure you let it sit, and you can rapidly build soil that way. Raised bed gardens, I think raised beds are an excellent option in the city in particular. They're safe, easy. There's some amazing sources for raised bed soil mixes. Our sponsor, Black Earth Compost, is an example of of a place you can get really high quality compost. So that there's a lot of different options around. You can get deliveries, you can and really work with it. If you have a neighborhood where you can get a delivery and then split it, that's also great. They hold a lot more moisture than containers do. You can easily add fencing, pest fencing, and they also warm up more quickly in the spring. So there's a lot of different ways to build raised beds. The way I do it is I take wood, oftentimes pine, unless you have an easy, readily available source of wood that doesn't break down very easily, like cedar or locust. That's oftentimes very expensive. So, but I use a non-toxic wood stabilizer, which just soaks into the wood and prevents it from breaking down. Also, you can get that online as well. Screws pre-drilled so the wood doesn't split and mess up your stability there. And then also raised bed soil mix, generally a blend of compost and loam. So what you're also doing once you make the frame for your raised bed, you're going to take hardware cloth, which is kind of like chicken wire, but a little smaller. So it's a stiff metal mesh. And then also landscape fabric, which is water permeable. So earthworms can go in and out. Oftentimes they seep in the sides. Or they come in the raised bed mix, but it prevents a lot of the more aggressive roots in your raised bed from going down into the soil. A lot of the more aggressive, the existing soil underneath, a lot of the more aggressive soil or roots, plants, like say tomatoes, they also tend to be fruiting crops. So unless you're growing serious root vegetables that puncture down into it, you should be fine. And even then, unless so you can put raised beds directly on asphalt. You can easily set them up with irrigation, drip irrigation, or other pieces. So again, try not to make them more than 4 feet wide, and that way it's just easy to access them. They can be as long as you want, but again, just make them easy to get around and a joy to be in. So the top picture is, you can see there's actually six raised beds in this back area, and it's kind of a fisheye lens. So there seems to be a lot more concrete than normal. This is the beginning. The top picture is the beginning of the season. The bottom is with a lot of growth partway through this summer. So there's a lot of different things growing, and again, like having mulch, having cover. I use a lot of sticks and other things as my support, so I have some stakes, but I kind of use a mix of things. But it can be really wild but fun, and you can do a lot even with just a few raised beds, and you can produce quite a bit of food. So container gardens are also an excellent option. And one of the things, so container gardens, the downsides, they tend to be the most expensive option generally, because you have to come up with the container and the soil, and they don't produce as much oftentimes as a raised bed because it's hard to regulate soil moisture. And but you can do it creatively, and every now and then you can have incredible yield. So this is a variety of kale called monster kale, which I'm just blown away by, but I grew this in a container and it outperformed all the same variety of kale that I planted in my raised beds. And I don't know if it was the soil type or if it was the way I mulched it or what, but the leaves were huge. And this was taken in November. So I was harvesting kale through the winter, and it was beautiful, incredibly sweet and very hardy, and it's still going right now. So I'm still harvesting leaves off this plant as it came back in the spring. And so now I'm getting the little fresh shoots. But there's a lot of really excellent options. So I think Hannah might be able to tell you a little bit more about this, but year-round indoor salad gardening is a great option. It's if you have very minimal indoor space, you can even grow salad greens in less than 10 days in an indoor space that doesn't have full sun. Milk crate gardens are another option of very inexpensively and quickly putting together gardens that even have little hand holders on the side, so you can move them wherever you want. There are whole milk crate farms on rooftops in different places, so I would definitely check it out. And then also one other option I'll give you for containers is self-watering containers. They are a way to try to maintain moisture in the plant. You can make them yourself or you can buy them. They have water at the base, and they wick up water into the main plant soil body. So there's a little spout where you pour the water in and fill up this reservoir. And they kind of use this wicking action to keep the soil moist. And they outperform other containers quite a bit. So I've had a lot of success with those, and I would really recommend them. Yeah, so this is I guess the end here, and thank you very much for listening, and I'll stop the screen share so we can start with questions.
Thanks, Allison. That was awesome. And thanks for all the great questions that were coming in. So I will start out with the first set of questions, which are really, what other contaminants should people be worried about besides lead? So you kind of briefly mentioned that, Allison, but I think folks were wanting to know a little bit more about some of the other contaminants that they might need to be worried about.
Yeah, so and I don't think that UMass does this anymore unless there's a more expensive test now called total sorbed metals test. But to give you just a rundown, the other things that they used to test on there were lead, cadmium, chromium, copper, mercury, nickel, boron, zinc. So there are a couple things. So a couple of those nutrients are not problems for people, because they will, if they get too high, the levels get too high, they actually kill the plant, and so we don't have to worry about them unless you're eating the soil. But the ones that accumulate in the plant are more of a problem. So I think it's things like arsenic, cadmium, lead, but a lot of, like, for example, arsenic can be linked oftentimes with lead too. So for example, old orchards are a place where you'd see a lot of them, but lead arsenate was the pesticide. So I think oftentimes lead is an indicator of a lot of problems. Also, like, say, an old burned trash pile usually has a lot of lead in it as well. There are other issues. So if you see I think the nice thing about a lot of heavy metals are tricky, because if they get to levels that are too high in the soil, they're still there. You can buffer them, but they're there. And organic pollutants, so like things like pesticides or oil or coal or other things that are kind of that are not good to ingest, the soil biology does have an incredible capacity to break down. So again, really maximizing that soil biology. And if you do think you might have one of those other issues, definitely I would recommend inoculating seeds with the full spectrum inoculant, but also there's a lot of biological products for soils to just really maximize that soil biology. And a biologically complete compost as well is excellent. So that would be.
Glad you mentioned the arsenic, because that was somebody else had a question about that. They have elevated arsenic levels on their property, and they just wanted to sort of confirm that. So they were told by their county extension agents that arsenic isn't mobile in the soil and plants don't accumulate it, but it seems like that's not true for crops like rice. So is that really true? Is arsenic immobile in the soil? What should people be worried about it?
So arsenic, it does accumulate in some plants, but a lot of them aren't edible. So I would not do foraging in that area, for example, because there are a couple wilder plants that do accumulate it. Again, if you can, so one of the reasons, at least from my understanding of why rice accumulates it as well, is oftentimes the floodplains are the plains are flooded, and so you are losing your soil biology as well. So you're losing that buffer, and your plants are kind of uptaking different things. That may not be the exact explanation of why. There could be other reasons as well, like the floodwaters coming in might have high levels, and I don't know that directly for sure, so I don't take my word for that. But I think a lot of the same biological buffer, living soil, All those things can really help. And I would, if you're nervous about it, or if the levels are high enough that you don't feel confident in it, I would definitely go with a raised bed or containers, and maybe kind of build up that soil organic matter levels in the meantime.
Do you have anything to add to that, Laura or Anna?
A lot of times what we try to do as well is look at a history of the site itself. We have run into some things where coal ash was used because the industry that was there before, or even structures that were there previous, may have used coal as a heating source, and so the ash is left over. And when we do the soil test, yes, we do the typical lead test, but then if you go a little deeper, you hit this weird ash. And when that's tested, we find that it's coal. And at that point, usually those areas, you tend to put more of your fruits, like your raspberries, your fruit trees at that point. But pretty much what we've been seeing so far is the lead. I have the opportunity now of working with the bioremediation project that will happen with Gardening the Community and Home City Housing here in Springfield. So it will be interesting to see what comes up on a brand new lot in the near the Liberty Apartments on Franklin Street in Springfield. So, but generally, what we've been seeing is just the history. There may have been, like ironically, where I live, there was a big explosion, chemical explosion, and so there was some residue of some other things that we didn't know about. So it's always good to use the history of a site as your marker as well to see if there's possibly some other contaminants.
I think too, especially, I know, Carol, we learned from UFI and Revision that when the city sponsors a urban farm, they do this sort of testing, and if it does come back with high levels of these metals, that they require a barrier, some sort of barrier underneath, and then build up of the soil and compost of about 18 inches. So I guess that's always a good thing to think about, just building up on top, as Allison mentioned, the raised beds can answer a lot of problems.
Mm-hmm.
Another
That's
thing
great.
I'll
Yeah. Another question was, is it safe to use raised beds if you have lead in your soil? So maybe that gets to the question of how to prepare the site before you put in the raised bed.
Oh yes. At our site at the Mason Square Library here in Springfield, when the test came back, it was well over the parts per million to go in ground. So the raised beds that were constructed, we have 4 layers, starting with crushed stone and then wood chips, a little more crushed stone. So we created actually about 4 or 5 layers between what was the initial ground or soil, and then built that up starting with the crushed stone. So we have a more permanent layer, put the structure over that, then filled it with composted soil after that. So raised beds definitely could be of great use. And something that Allison mentioned that I wanted to go back to, even on your property, I found with my property, there are areas that were fine, no lead issues. But as I got closer to the house, because it's an older house, and speaking to those folks who may have older houses, it's good. Just go ahead and start off with the raised bed. That way you're safe. And that has been, once I did the test, I realized that was a good decision. And for other backyard gardeners, we're finding the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a lot of questions about plants and then a few questions about animals. So let's start with the plants. So there's a question, Allison, about if you throw away the sunflowers that you've used for your phytoremediation, aren't you just contaminating somewhere else? And so what should you do with sunflowers that you pull up?
So there's I guess a couple different options. So I guess the most extreme option is some people will just bag them up, especially the seed heads, and throw them out in the landfill. So that is an option. Or you could also sort of put them in a specific spot, maybe mixed with lots of biochar or other things, and kind of like move it to an area that isn't going to be used for growing at all. So I think Paul Stamets does, what he does with mycoremediation is he pulls toxins and actually burns the mushrooms, and then takes the ash and then puts it in a spot away from growing. Like, so it's accumulated, but it's removed out of the growing area. So there's a couple different options there. They're not all great options, you know. Those are a couple different options.
It's probably helpful to note that lead is not such a huge problem for every organism, right? But we shouldn't be having it where we're growing food for us to eat.
Exactly. And then just re-emphasizing, if you do a raised bed, that landscape fabric underneath, if you're really concerned about either invasive weeds or things poking up or stuff going down, you can do multiple layers, but it is water permeable, but it's a root barrier. So having that barrier underneath is really kind of another added confidence piece.
Great. Another plant question, comfrey is often recommended for chop and drop mulching because it's a good hyperaccumulator, so it's good for, you know, like bringing nutrients up to make them more available. But should we not use comfrey for that purpose when soil might be contaminated?
I would say, so the more, I think it depends on what you're most comfortable with too. So it is an excellent hyperaccumulator. And again, if you do have of many nutrients that are really useful, if you do have concerns about lead levels or higher contamination on the higher end, I would, I think it's a really reasonable thing not to use it. But if it's on the lower end and you're building up your soil biology and maximizing your soil's capacity to create humic acid, that really does kind of immobilize a lot of the, like it really does help mobilize the things that the plants need, and not, and it can kind of almost like hold, not lock up completely, but it can kind of hold them in the soil. I've also heard about certain plants, and I am still learning about this, but that mobilize things like phosphorus. So like clover can help, or buckwheat or some other things, but can actually, some of those, when they're mobilized, I've heard people talk about them potentially binding up lead and other things. So I'm not sure exactly how it happens biologically, but whatever reason, the toxins become a lot less available very rapidly with the biology, which is encouraging.
And I would say that if you're going to use that comfrey to do it as Allison just described, don't use it for any salve or anything like that.
Yeah.
And just check with your municipality when it comes to disposal as well, if you're going to remove it off the property. And I'm speaking mostly to our community gardens. There's a particular way each city, each town's a little different about disposal.
So a related question to that, Anna, is someone has been digging up knotweed, and also they have a black locust problem on a portion of their yard. So you just mentioned correct disposal, but they want to know what's a responsible way to deal with the roots. I was thinking they were going to ask about how to dispose of the roots, but it's actually, the question is, what's a responsible way to deal with the roots that I cannot pull or dig up? So I guess it's less of a disposal question and more like, how do I get rid of these troublesome plants?
Yes, knotweed has its uses, and it could also be a headache. I totally understand that. One way that I have seen with gardening the community, they have done this. They have smothered it. You know, with any kind of plant, you got to cut off the sunlight. So they will smother it with a very heavy tarp, and we see that it actually kind of puts it down. But you got to keep doing it. That's the only thing when you're dealing with knotweed. With the, I think the other plant that you mentioned, the locust or walnut plant. There was another.
Yeah, it was black locust.
Okay. It depends on the plants as well. Now we've run into that with a couple of community gardens where there's a tree. Oftentimes it's the black walnut here. It does not like nightshades. They don't tend to do well, so we'll switch it out, put plants around it that will not be so affected by it. So that's a kind of a research there to find out what plants could cohabitate with that particular tree. Or if you just want to avoid it altogether, maybe you put more perennials, more flowers, and move your other edibles away from it. And another good option for a container, see, that could be a good place for a container, are grow bags. Grow bags start at $5. You can get some that are as large as a 4x8. They're felt, that heavy felt, and they last for a long time. And you can get them in different sizes. So that's another option if you are having, if you're fighting the knotweed, if you are fighting with different trees that are inhibiting growth. But with the knotweed, the smothering process seems to be working in spots where it's just totally overgrown.
I've just to echo that, I've seen that also as well. And some of the amounts of mulch I've seen it like up to 12 inches of wood chips with cardboard underneath, 12 inches of wood chips, and just then soil on top, or a blend to build it. One other option is that Mike Bald in Vermont has some interesting options for how to get rid of knotweed. And essentially the idea is to cut it, and it takes about 3 years. But you cut it the most in the first season, and anytime it straggles to come back up, you cut it again, and you just have to be on it in the spring and less, most the first year, but then less, and you're essentially bleeding the root dry, so it doesn't have the chance to recharge the root, and by the end they kind of scraggle up through. So that is a sort of a committed land management option, but also a really valid option without using chemicals.
Great. All right, a couple critter questions. I've heard really different things about dog poop and pee and its influence on soil. Do you have any advice? We have a dog and are also growing vegetables.
Oh.
Yeah, actually, so dog poop, cat poop, there's a lot of different ones, but even human stuff. We have a lot of parasites. We have a lot of the way it's put together. You have a lot of pathogenic type soil microorganisms that tend not to be great for soil, and they tend to linger a little bit more in the soil than other things. You can potentially, with a really hot composting process, but there's actually a really interesting, and I'm trying to remember the name of the book, but there's actually a mushroom guide, but there's some people who are mixing in mushroom substrate and inoculating dog poop specifically, and then also the base of chicken runs with mushrooms, not for eating, but for essentially breaking down toxins and also pathogens. So they're anti-pathogenic. And so I would definitely not recommend using it in and around the garden just for that reason. Or, again, putting it to a side and maybe trying a wood chip micro remediation project from a bacterial standpoint. And there are some mushrooms that do that really well.
Other thoughts about that, panelists?
I definitely wouldn't use it in your growing area if you're going to eat that food.
And I have to agree with that, because they do carry worms and other parasites, as Allison and Laura mentioned, particularly if you are living in more urban places, like here in Springfield or Boston. So it's not the safest thing to do.
And also in the same vein, composting, don't put it through a vermicompost. That's another thing, is because it doesn't, the pathogens can stay through a worm composter. So don't do that either. So
thanks for mentioning vermicomposting, one of our questions. And I know it's 7 o'clock. Let's just take a couple more questions to answer the rest of the questions. So how about active vermicompost? We compost indoors with worms, and it seems like it could be used for remediation. Is that true?
I think that's in terms of enhancing soil biology, that's awesome.
I don't have any experience with vermicomposting and remediation of those types of metals that we were talking about, but it sounds like it could be a good option.
That would be a good experiment. When Allison was talking about having those experimentation centers or places, that could be something to experiment with. If you have a part of your garden or your growing site that has some contamination, and you want to try it out, something that you're not going to necessarily eat, try it and see if it will work. You can always get it tested afterwards to see the results.
Awesome. I think that was all of the questions that we had. Oh, sorry, there's one more. someone has a container garden and their organic soil from last year was outside. They started to churn it up and found a huge mushroom growing inside. Is this good or bad? And is it healthy to reuse container soil from last year? And that will be our last question for the night.
I think it's totally fine to use the soil from last year. You know, if it looks like it needs some life in it, then you're going to want to do something with it, whether it be adding some inoculant to the soil or a little bit of compost to the soil. It would certainly help to put some life back into it, because depending upon where it was over the winter, it may or may not still have any life to it, but you definitely don't want to throw it away. Reuse it.
Usually what I do is I'll add an all-purpose organic fertilizer mix. Like there's one from North Country Organics called ProGrow, and I'll mix that in with some compost, and you can follow the recommendations or how much to add in based on the package. But it's because you've been taking nutrients out of it by growing plants and harvesting them, you do like adding something back in, whether it's you know, your own compost or somehow, you know, getting that refreshed, or even just for the adding in the soil biology. And reusing container soil is great, I think.
Yeah. And
but the mushroom is growing in it isn't a big deal, right?
Oh, that's
that's
a good thing. That's fine.
Yeah.
That's fine. And oftentimes with my containers, I may crush up some eggshells from my baking, just to give it a little calcium boost. And as Allison and Laura mentioned before, you know, a little bit of compost. If anyone is worm composting, you can take those those pieces and add it in, just to give it a little life and to wake it up before you start working in it.
One thing that's great about worms as well is they have oftentimes some runoff or compost tea, it's not compost tea directly, but it's liquid runoff, and you can mix that in and water your plants as well. So if you have a container garden, you can kind of supplement that in the watering as well. So there's a lot of different options, and there's a huge number of beneficial microorganisms in there as well.
Awesome. Well, thanks for staying a few minutes extra so we could get through all of the great questions that our attendees asked. And thank you all so much for coming tonight. I thought this webinar was really great. We've got lots of thank yous coming in over the questions and chat. So thanks so much, Allison, for the excellent presentation, and Anna and Laura for the really great Q&A support. So have a wonderful night, everybody, and stay healthy and stay well.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night. Be well.